At this time, I'd like to introduce our guests today who are here to talk about the upcoming symposium on human trafficking and modern slavery in today's world. We have Tina Papadopoulos from the Daughters of Penelope. Tina, say hello to us. How are you?
Good morning, Meleti. Kalimera sa Walus and Kalomina. Thank you so much for having us on today, Meleti. We truly appreciate it. We're very excited about this upcoming event that the Daughters of Penelope, the Boston chapter, is sponsoring this upcoming Saturday, which, excuse me, you just talked about on the Tipu Kepote, and you've been, I'm sorry, consistently for the last few weeks. So we truly appreciate it. The Daughters of Penelope is an international women's organization and has been around for 95 years. Celebrating this year 95th year, and so we are very excited. As I said, we are a service organization, and unlike years past when it was more bake sales and things like that as it started out, and as an auxiliary of AHEPA, it has grown significantly and changed significantly. And we do a lot of things for the benefit of those who are less fortunate, and also want to bring education and awareness on various subjects, such as this, in addition to promoting women.
How did this come about? How did you find, because you're chairing this event,
Yes.
how did you bring this forward?
I have known Dr. Prodromou, excuse me, for many, many, many years, longtime friends. And we've done a project, I think, or one or two together in the past. But I had been hearing about this for a long time and had, spoken with Elizabeth about it. And we had talked about doing some things. And in terms of schedule-wise, it wasn't able to really gel till now. But in between that time, to be able to schedule this, I had gone to an event that was hosted by the Philoptochos in Arlington. And both Elizabeth was there, as well as Vasileia, Dr. Digidiki, and it was phenomenal.
Yeah.
I left, well, first off, I have to tell you that the entire time, I think there were maybe four or five speakers, and it was amazing to me, amazing in the sense that I just could not believe what was happening in front of us, and we just don't even realize it. And hearing about this, and we tend to think about sexual trafficking as that's what comes to mind first, but it is so much more.
It is, yeah.
And that is what we want to bring awareness of, so that people understand what's happening. And there'll be many different topics that will be discussed. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Prodromou and Dr. Digidiki, but for people to come, it is a heavy subject. It's a heavy subject.
It is.
And I think that people will be, it's going to be educational. I think that your jaw will drop a few times when you hear about what's actually happening in our backyards. This is not just something that's across the ocean, or, it's here. So we're very excited to be able to bring this, this to this forum, and having the esteemed speakers that we have on the list.
You have announced that the event is free, but registration is required. This is an important point, especially to the Greek community, because we all sort of just are used to showing up maybe sometimes late and usually get things at the door. If someone shows up at the door and they have not registered, what happens?
Yes, so we do want to let people know is we prefer if people could register in advance, just because it makes it easier for planning purposes. However, if people can come to the door, that won't be a problem, and they can just register at that time. We will have, in terms of logistics, we will start registering, checking in at 9:15. There'll be some coffee and some. Actually, I just heard from my committee members last night that they have a nice little spread happening for the morning, but people are invited to come, have a little kafedaiki, get to meet some people, and then we will begin the program at 10 a.m. With the goal of finishing about 1:15, and then we will have a little bit of a reception afterwards, just because, again, after you hear the panelists, and of course there'll be a break in between, but you want to talk to people. They'll have a chance to meet our panelists and just sort of digest a little bit with other people what they're going to be hearing on that day.
Thank you, Tina. We have two guests here who are in the studio. Well, three. You're a guest as well, Tina. Don't. But I'd like to first introduce Dr. Vasileia Digidiki. She's holds a PhD as an instructor at Harvard University, a Health and Human Rights Fellow at Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, and the director of the Harvard Summer Course on Migration and Refugee Studies. She's a psychologist by training and leads the Harvard FXB Center's program on distress migration. Since 2014, and alongside with Professor Balba, she has conducted research in Greece, Bangladesh, West and Central Africa, Sudan, Poland, Colombia, and Mexico, focusing, among other topics, on child protection and on the nexus between human trafficking, sexual and labor exploitation, and distress migration. Her research has been funded by a number of international organizations, including IOM and BROC. And in 2023, Dr. Digidiki and the Harvard FXB Center, along with the International Organization for Migration, produced the first worldwide report on child trafficking, analyzing the large worldwide data set on child trafficking victims. Dr. Digidiki has worked for more than 15 years on issues of human trafficking and victim blaming. She has published extensively on issues of human trafficking, child protection, and refugee rights, and has participated in a number of high-level meetings, and has guest lectured at different universities across the world. She holds a PhD in clinical and social psychology, 2 master's degrees on forensic and social psychology, and a bachelor's degree on psychology. Kalimera, good morning, Dr. Digidiki.
Good morning, Kalimera. Good morning to everyone who is listening to us this morning, and thank you so much for having me today to discuss about, I would say, the worst plight of humanity.
Thank you so much for coming in. And we have as well Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou. She's a professor in the International Studies program at Boston College and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center, a member of the Global Academic Council of the International Religious Freedom Secretariat. She has served as a diplomat on the U.S. Commission of International Religious Freedom and as a member of the U.S. Secretary of State's Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. Dr. Prodromou works with international organizations and institutions on diplomatic trainings on religious literacy, security, and human rights. She also directs leadership training programs for faith-based institutions. Kalimera, Dr. Prodromou.
Good morning, Meleti. Thank you for welcoming us, and it's great to be here in the studio with good friends and with the opportunity to talk about, as Vasu said, and I hope we can all use first names here since we're all dear friends.
Oh, good.
But as Vasu said, I would say the scourge of humanity in our time.
When we speak about human trafficking and modern slavery, I guess first let's have a definition around that. How would you define this?
That's a great question. I think people are much more familiar with the term human trafficking. It's been in some ways mainstreamed in the media and in corporate conversations, etc. But modern slavery is a term that is less familiar to people, and it's an umbrella term that refers to situations where a person or groups of people are under the control of others or more specifically subjected to coercion and violence for purposes of exploitation. So it's control, violence, and exploitation of one human being or groups of human beings by others. And I think for our purposes on Saturday, what's really important is to recognize that human trafficking is simply one dimension of a multidimensional intersecting phenomenon. We tend to think of slavery as something that is in the past, and yet today we know that the Walk Free Foundation, for example, the International Labor Organization, they compile numbers, and we know that today there are more people in absolute numbers who are subjected to forms of enslavement than at any other time in human history, which is, it's really shocking to think that we're in the 21st century and we're talking about modern slavery. And some different forms that might be useful for us to think about include, of course, human trafficking, the associated industry of human smuggling, and certainly Vaso can tell us more about that, the distinctions between those two, but also forced labor, where people work against their will under exploitative conditions, and that disproportionately affects children, particularly in developing, but in developed countries. We're talking about debt bondage, where people are forced to work to pay off a debt that in reality can probably never be repaid. So they are caught in this cycle of trying to repay. They're enslaved by their debt. We're also talking about sexual exploitation that includes both online digital forms of sexual exploitation and in person. And I think the digital forms are especially pernicious because they're in some ways hidden. People access them through particular sites and platforms, and they include the sexual exploitation in particular of children and even babies. And they also include online fora, auctions for trading children and young women and girls. And then finally, two other aspects of enslavement in our time include something that might be counterintuitive to a lot of people, but when we think about it, it makes sense, include addictions. So where people are literally enslaved to substances outside of their control, those substances control them. And then finally, we're talking about supply chain questions. We tend to forget that the things we put on our back, the things we put in our feet, the components that are in our phones, the food that we consume, oftentimes those are they're produced by enslaved labor and the conditions that I talked about. So one of our goals is to make it clear that when we talk about slavery, it still exists today, and in its modern forms, it's multidimensional, intersectional, and oftentimes right in front of us, but we don't see it.
And on the statistics, Dr. Digidiki, Vaso, if I may, it must be difficult to quantify this because these are just the cases we know about. And could you speak about how you first came up with your numbers? In your bio, we read that you had the first really published report on this. How did you collect that data?
Yes. First of all, I just want to highlight what Elizabeth said, that we think that slavery has ended, but unfortunately it continues. It has just changed name. It is called human trafficking. And I know that we can spend a lot of time talking about definitions, official definitions, but I think that what we need to remember right now is that human trafficking is a multifaceted and complex phenomenon. It has been described as a monster, and it continues to spread and expand within and across borders. And just to state it more simply so everyone can understand it, it is not just a phenomenon, it is not just a crime, it is a silent and silent pandemic that unfortunately is being tolerated many times, even when proliferating in plain sight. And going back to your statistics, the question about statistics. So right now it is estimated that the number of victims around the world reaches 40 million, with 1 in 4 victims being a child. But of course, this is just an estimate. We do not know the actual number of victims across the world because human trafficking is a hidden phenomenon. We cannot see the victims, we cannot see their suffering. We only see the victims who, I would put it in quotes, they're lucky to be, to escape from this situation, and the number is unfortunately very, very low. The data set that I analyzed a few years ago, it was a data set that included more than 100,000 victims across the world, and they were all children. But this is the number of children that had been rescued by IOM, the International Organization for Migration, in a period of 20 years. So again, this is not even, it doesn't even reflect the reality across the world. It was just one organization that in a span of 20 years, they were able to help and rescue 100,000 children across the world.
In your statistics, does it mention the demographics or a breakdown, say, by country, or how is your data sorted?
So again, this depends on who provides the data, because, for example, in the case of IOM, depending on the countries and the regions where the organization operates, you may see more victims being rescued or less victims being rescued. Again, this doesn't reflect the reality, and this is a question that I oftentimes I receive. So, who is more possible to become a victim, or women more vulnerable, or men are more vulnerable, kids or not? So, what I want to say for everyone to remember is that victims of human trafficking can be anyone, regardless of race, color, national origin, disability, religion, age, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, or education status. Under certain circumstances, everyone can become a victim of human trafficking, including, as Elizabeth mentioned before, babies. Because in my research, we found out that more than 2,000 victims were babies aged 0 to 2 years old, which means that these babies were born into trafficking by mothers that were victims of human trafficking.
Oh, yeah. How horrible. It's just a horrible thing. But yet it's been around for a long time, where many of us are just hearing more of it now because of these awareness campaigns. Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you about the Patriarchates Task Force. How did that get started? I remember, and I printed out a little joint declaration that was done by Archbishop Bartholomew, and this was at the Fenar back in 2017. And they had just, between Archbishop Bartholomew and the Archbishop Justin of Canterbury, they had made a statement saying that that we need to become aware of this, and we need to do what we can to stop this activity. Do you remember, is that how the task force was born, or how did this task force get started, and how did you get involved?
Sure, I can tell you a little bit about the background of the task force and also as it relates to the ongoing work. But I do want to emphasize something that Vaso said, which is that when we talk, she was speaking about trafficking in particular, but more broadly, with all these facets of modern slavery, there's an intergenerational component that babies are born to mothers who are being trafficked, or children are born to parents who are working under forced labor conditions, and those children then they're born into those conditions and they don't escape them. So there's an intergenerational component, and certainly there's a global component. And I think that's really important for us to remember, because it may be that the origins of some of the enslavement are in less developed countries, but the consumers of individuals or the products that they produce are oftentimes in developed countries. And that's particularly an issue when it comes in the US, for example, to domestic labor, where we see high levels of women and children who are trafficked, and also of sexual exploitation of domestic workers. But so going to your question now about the Patriarchs Task Force, in 2017, His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople established a task force on modern slavery, more specifically to combat these diverse forms, raise awareness, develop capacity, and have an impact on these diverse forms of modern slavery. And so in 2017, he appointed his initial task force. Now Archbishop Nikita of London in the UK was appointed, at the time Archbishop Metropolitan Nikita was appointed the head of the task force, and I was appointed along with Presbytera Maria Drosos,
Oh.
whose husband and she reside here in Arlington, Father
Yes.
Odisea.
Yes.
They were in Canada at the time. So the three of us were appointed, and we worked very closely as well with the English Language Office of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, Deacon Nifon Simalis, who's now at the cathedral in London, the Greek Orthodox Cathedral, and Mr. George Saraf, who was a PhD student. And so we were charged with trying to architect a set of initial events, inaugural events, and a strategy by which the Patriarchate could lead, along with other faith-based leaders in the world, in raising awareness and having impact on this issue. So we convened an initial conference in Istanbul and Constantinople that brought together experts across different sectors. So there were academics like Vaso and myself who, work in different disciplines but related disciplines. There were experts from the global public health space. There were people who work in international and local law, as well as in law enforcement and security. And then there were also people who came from the private sector who are very aware of this question of supply chains and bonded labor. And the idea was to introduce this topic to this audience and also to begin building a network. And the Archbishop of Canterbury was there at that first conference. But subsequent to that, the task force held events in Buenos Aires, Argentina, again in Istanbul. There have been events in Greece and in the United States at the local level. And the goal, again, of these efforts, I would say, are the following. Number one, to raise awareness and educate people about what is happening. And the title of that first meeting in Istanbul was called Sins Before Our Eyes, to emphasize the fact that whether you are a faith believer or a secular person, what's being done to human beings by other human beings is indeed a sin, and it's happening before our eyes. So first thing, raise awareness and educate. Number two, take purposeful action, which means developing the skill sets to work. If you're a faith-based ministry, in the case of the Patriarchate, a ministry of the church, but other faith communities are working on this as well. The Vatican, the Anglican Church, and others, to develop capacity to take purposeful action. And if you don't know what action to take, to understand who are other experts you can look to. Because you always want to be cognizant of the fact that in these very, very situations where human beings are so vulnerable, with the best of intentions, you might take an action that produces blowback and negative consequences. So how to make those very nuanced assessments. And then finally, how to have measurable impact. How do we measure whether or not we're doing good and whether we're helping this problem? And so those are the top three goals. And then the other philosophical, or in this case theological, sort of perspective that informed and continues to inform this work was, again, to emphasize that whether you're a person of faith or a person of no faith, at the end of the day, we are all human beings, and so we all have to work cooperatively to combat these different aspects of enslavement. And then finally, I would say that another key message from the work of the task force has been that these are complex problems, what are called in complexity theory and in organizational behavior, wicked problems. And they're wicked because they have no single cause, because they are problems whose participants adapt to efforts to solve the problem, and therefore they require multi-stakeholder collaborative approaches. And so this has been the approach of these task force events, especially to build capacity and also to work collaboratively to address these issues. And if I could use the example of a water balloon. If you've been at a kid's birthday party and you have, these balloons that are filled with water, and you squeeze one part of the balloon and then it bulges at another part, that's the complexity piece of this. You may address one particular aspect of enslavement, but if you don't understand the linkages, you don't see, where it continues in those other spaces.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions to both of you. How do we get at the underlying issues? So we can report on the activity, we can look at the activity, we could try to raise awareness, but how do we address, are there policy things that can be done? I remember when I was young, there was a campaign, a national campaign about that you have a responsibility to report child abuse. And that if you didn't report it and it was right before your eyes, then you're just as fault. I have not seen any national campaigns. I'm starting to see some things turn up at airports, universities, and in the business sector. But can we address the underlying issues? Is there anything that can be done on a policy?
Yes, so this is an excellent question. And the reason why you haven't seen so much effort is because we have very recently started focusing on combating human trafficking. In fact, believe it or not, it was only in 2000 that we came up with the definition of human trafficking. And we signed the Palermo Agreement, and we defined human trafficking. This doesn't mean that it didn't exist before. Of course it existed. And I really want to say to people that where there is misery and pain, traffickers do not see a tragedy, but an opportunity for more profit. And this existed forever. However, since 2000, we started noticing the phenomenon. We named it, we started researching it, we tried to understand its footprint so we can come up with policies to be able to deal with it. However, the last 25 years, I can say that there is a chasm between theory, legal obligation, administrative practice, and public perceptions. And if I have time, I will talk a little bit about that later on. So what we see right now, it is a failure in policy priorities, a lack of essential resources for victim care and protection, a lack of clarity around who is and who is not a victim, and this links to the work that I do on victim blaming, as well as a pervasive lack of basic knowledge and understanding of the phenomenon at the societal level. And something very extremely important, again, is that the phenomenon evolves. Traffickers evolve. So they're always one step ahead. We try to understand their techniques, we try to understand their strategies, and then as soon as we understand it and try to deal with them, they adapt. For example, and something that Elizabeth mentioned before, when COVID started, all exploitation moved online. And just in the first 3 months of the lockdown, the Interpol documented 4.2 million cases of online sexual exploitation of children, just 3 months after lockdown.
Really?
In 2023, popular platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter detected 36 million images of child sexual exploitation.
So it seems to me that we need to get to the children. It seems to me that these symposiums or this education, these awareness campaigns need to happen at the school level.
So this takes us back to what we can do. So there are efforts, a lot of efforts in policy level, but all of the people who are listening today may say, well, okay, policy level, government. Maybe we can see who we're going to vote because they're going to affect the laws, but this is our role and this is what we have to do. No, what we're trying to do through all these awareness raising campaigns is to explain to people that all these efforts to start bottom up. We also have a role to play in this. First of all, by understanding who is a victim, and also by understanding what is our role in this human trafficking chain. Because as Elizabeth mentioned, labor exploitation involves the use of so many products that we use in our daily life. And I always ask people, do you know where your coffee, the one that you drink every morning, comes from?
Right.
Your chocolate, your shoes, the batteries in your computer or your phone. So this is where we start. And many people keep saying, so, okay, let's say that I stop drinking coffee or I stop drinking specific chocolate. Will I change the world? Well, the change starts from one person.
Right. And so, do you think that from a policy perspective that we could say that we will only import products that have these guidelines in the workspace, or that we, I'm trying to, how do people know that the shirt that they're buying was stitched by someone that's making 10 cents an hour and isn't as, how do we know that?
This is where the government also comes in, and they need to work with the organizations to have specific guidelines on with whom they work and the conditions where people work. And now we come in and we see these conditions, and we judge if we want to buy this product or not. For example, if we see a product here that is relatively cheap, and then we see that on top is being made in Thailand or in Taiwan or in other these places, then we should search a little bit more the conditions that each company forces their workers to work under, and then we can judge.
Definitely. Something was said earlier, and I want to go back to it, and it's that if you're being exploited, you should report it, or if you know someone that's exploited. But I want to take a scenario. And I think this is very common now. We have a lot of people who are here illegally, and it seems like they might be ripe for exploitation, because someone might say, if you say anything, I'm going to report you and I'm going to send you in. Now, what do they do?
So it is very easy for us to say that someone who is being victimized should report it. Mm-hmm. They cannot report it, because maybe they don't have the option to go to the authorities to report it, or very well, as you said, they may not want to do it because they're afraid. They're afraid for their lives, they're afraid for their families' lives, or they're afraid to be deported, or they're afraid for the worst, because they're being blackmailed by the exploiters and the traffickers. So this is where our role comes in, and this is where policies come in. For us, if we are educated, and we are properly educated, and we see red flags, we see signs of exploitation, the first thing that we can do is to inform the authorities. There are many hotlines that people can call. There are many organizations that work with victims of human trafficking. I always say that if you suspect a case of exploitation, it's better to go to report it, and then the authorities can figure out if this is exploitation or not, rather than to think, maybe I shouldn't get involved because maybe it's not exploitation, and then we let the exploitation continue. But for us, in order for us to be able to do this, we need to be educated. We need to know what human trafficking is. And this brings us back to what I said before about victim blaming. And I would like to take maybe 30 seconds to talk a little bit about this. Victim blaming, in very simple words, is the harmful practice of holding victims responsible for the crimes or misfortunes that happen to them, instead of focusing on the actions of the perpetrator, the trafficker in this case, or even the person who gets the services from the victims. We have seen this happening a lot in situations like sexual harassment or rape or domestic violence or even bullying. The victim may be blamed for their actions, appearance, behavior, or even decisions, which wrongly suggests that they somehow provoked or they deserved the harm that was done to them. And of course, as you understand, this has serious consequences, such as discouraging victims from reporting their victimization or seeking help, reinforcing harmful stereotypes, contributing to a culture of silence around abuse or injustice. And of course, it leads to the re-victimization of the victim. And it is I have seen it many times in the work that I do, particularly with children, that, they're not victims of sexual exploitation. They're prostitutes. They're sex workers. Choose your word, it's the same. But if you choose these words instead of saying that these are victims of human trafficking, you exonerate the trafficker and you put the blame on these kids. And I have seen it a lot happening, particularly with kids that are not, they're teenagers, adolescents, they're 16, 17, and you cannot very easily say whether they're kids or not. And immediately as a society, we put the blame on them. We don't care to help them, or we just see their exploitation happening, and we don't take a step to help them.
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I do think it's important to underscore and highlight what Vas was saying about victim blaming, that oftentimes the reaction to different forms of modern slavery, in particular bonded labor and the supply chain issues that go along with that, or also substance abuse. People will react by saying, well, people made bad choices and now, they have to face the consequences. Or people allowed themselves to be trafficked. People choose to be trafficked because they're most oftentimes fleeing insecurity. They're fleeing active conflict. They're fleeing lack of access to natural resources that allow them to survive on a daily basis. And they're looking for a way out of impoverishment. And so when you asked about key causal factors and what can be done, I think at the policy level, it's really important to reintroduce a word that seems to have fallen out of fashion in our world, which is poverty. People live in different forms of poverty around the world, including in this country, where people live impoverished. And so all of the aspects of modern slavery that we've been discussing go back to this question of insecurity, and most specifically economic insecurity and impoverishment that doesn't allow them to escape broader conditions of insecurity, and therefore that makes them oftentimes make hard choices about trying to escape by selling themselves, right, or by harvesting their organs, for example, so that they can have the money to get to a safer space. So I think we really do need to change our mindset when we encounter this phenomenon. And I also think, we need to think about a whole of government approach. This is not a phenomenon and a set of problems that can be resolved by a single agency. We need to recognize the intersectionality. And then finally, something very simple. You asked, if I stop buying my coffee or eating my chocolate or buying my, sports paraphernalia with labels, will I be resolving the problem? We will be not complicit in the problem, because inaction or ignorance, looking the other way, is complicity. And that's a moral issue. Right. And I think we need to look in the mirror and recognize that. Because it's like saying, I don't commit murder. Am I going to stop people from being murdered? No, but I would never commit murder. It's that mindset issue when it comes to all of these aspects of modern slavery.
There was an old saying that said, silence gives consent.
That's right.
Absolutely.
So we need to speak up. We need to identify this. But there needs to be more signage, I think. Someone was telling me at the airport they saw a sticker in the bathroom on the back of the door saying, are you being forced? Are you being held here?
Right.
And call this number. And I thought, brilliant. That's what we need. And understand how to make that language a little simpler for the victim, and if there is a way of protecting them so that they're not going to get turned in. I mean, we do this with the Penelope's place, right? If someone calls up in there, there's a privacy kind of a blanket around them.
Oh, absolutely right with that, and actually that will be spoken to about as well on Saturday with Julia Kehoe, who's the CEO of Health Imperatives, which oversee that. Penelope's Place, which is a home or housing for survivors of domestic abuse and their children, but also, and this is a year-old, Sanctuary Place, which is a housing for survivors of sexual trafficking. So they'll be talking about that.
If you're just tuning in, our guest this morning is Tina Papadopoulos from the Daughters of Penelope, and they are presenting a symposium on human trafficking and modern slavery in today's world this Saturday, April 5th at the Meletios Cultural Center at 50 Goddard Avenue in Brookline. The morning starts at 9:15. It goes right up until 1. There'll be panel discussions moderated by Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou, who is here with us in the studio today. She is from the Ecumenical Patriarchate's Task Force on Modern Slavery. And that was our station ID. And she's a professor at Boston College in the Program of International Studies. Also joining us here in the studio, one of the panelists, Dr. Vasileia Digidiki, and she is Health and Human Rights Fellow at Harvard's FXB Center. What I want to ask you, these panelists are very well known. Do you all know each other? Do you know some of the other panelists?
Well, I have to say that I know Elizabeth very well because, I think I know you for the past 10 years. She was the one who reached out to me to join the first event of the Ecumenical Patriarch Task Force. So I joined her and many other scholars in Istanbul in 2016. So, and we know each other since. And then I met Tina as well.
Oh, that's nice. Okay.
And all the panelists, by the way, you know, it was with the great help of Elizabeth to help us put together really an esteemed panel of experts to talk about what's happening. And even just now, listening to both of you, my heart drops. It's amazing to hear this again, not in a good way, but that this is happening. It's happening right in front of us. And you know, what are the ways that we can help this? Excuse, I don't have my radio voice this morning. Sorry.
Oh, you sound great. Yeah.
But it's a pretty deep subject, and one that we have to be made aware of.
Do the victims understand their rights? Do they understand that someone can't take your passport? And do they understand these things? They probably don't, right?
This was something that I wanted to mention before. Elizabeth talked about poverty, and I will link this to wars across the world, which brings us to migration, which is a very controversial topic right now across the world, of course. We have seen the nexus between human trafficking and migration, forced displacement, to become more evident, more and more and more. I am from the island of Lesbos. I was born there, raised there. I came to the US 10 years ago, and when the refugee crisis started in 2015, I was there, first as a first responder and then as a researcher. And I met so many victims of human trafficking come out of these boats trying to find a better life in Europe. And many people, and Greece was exposed to this phenomenon because it was not just the refugee crisis, it was also human trafficking and all these networks coming into Greece to take advantage of vulnerable migrants and refugees. And a lot of people were saying, but why do they attempt to go to a different country? Why they're not staying in their own countries, and then they will not become victims of human trafficking? Well, if you decide to put your kids in a boat and cross the sea, it's because your place is not safe anymore.
Right.
And the research that took place by UNICEF in 2016 showed that girls who follow the central Mediterranean route of migration, meaning from all the African countries towards Italy. This is the central Mediterranean route of migration. Knew very well that they will get sexually exploited on the route. And do you know what they did? They were taking contraceptive pills to avoid rape-induced pregnancy. They knew very well what would happen, but they knew that the risk for their life was higher if they had to stay in their country.
Yeah, right. Oh, these are situations that we don't understand, in the comforts of our suburban homes. We don't see a lot of this.
Meleti.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that I'm flabbergasted because to hear that those are their choices.
Right.
That's what their two choices are.
Right.
To either stay in an unsafe area or
they know when they
the other end.
Right.
I can't even talk about it. I'm getting goosebumps when I'm hearing you talk about this.
And to honor Odysseus in this case, I always say that they are between Scylla and Charybdis.
That's right.
You have to choose between Scylla and Charybdis.
Right. Yeah.
And we do see those things. We just don't know we're seeing them. You said, in the comfort of a suburban home. If you go to a nail salon, if you buy your coffee, when you go buy your next iPhone, and you think about the rare earth minerals that are going to power everything from iPhones to weapons today, but a user of an iPhone, who extracted those? Under what conditions were they extracted? When you buy your sports gear and look at labels, under what conditions were children and intergenerational bonded labor responsible for producing them? Those, when you go to your nail salon and you are getting your nails done, you think about, were those women put in containers on ships and brought to the United States without without papers because they want to be able to send money home, and they think that they're promised when they get here they will receive the legal documentation. So it's all around us, whether we're in the comfort of our, suburban lifestyles or not. We just don't see it because we don't know about it, or we choose not to know about it. And I think that's the important thing here, that in a world where we have access to technology, we can learn about almost any of these things if we choose to.
I think so. I was going to ask you if this is a great segue into my next question, which is, what is the best website or websites that people can go to for information, not just statistics, but the kinds of things we were talking about, of how to identify this, what you can do if you see it, if you're part of it. Is there a website or a service that you know of?
Vasa, you can speak to this, but one site that I think is viewed as very reliable is the Walk Free Foundation's the Global Slavery Index, and that also has an interactive map, because you asked earlier, Meleti, about sort of the geography, and this is in fact a global geography, but the geography of modern slavery in these various dimensions. That's a really great site, and it has really important links to other sites that you can visit. But that's where I would urge someone who initially wants to learn about the phenomenon to begin.
I would agree with that. I would say that there are so many organizations across the world, international organizations and local organizations if you're in a specific country, or if you want to learn the situation in a specific country. For example, in Greece, we have many organizations in Greece as well. Any organization, if you type human trafficking in the US, human trafficking in Greece, or human trafficking globally, the first results that will come up on Google are from very, very good organizations that work on this topic for years. Also, even if you go on YouTube, you will find very, very good information and very good videos that will, literally in 2 minutes, will summarize what you need to know for someone who has never known about the phenomenon before. And very recently, I learned about an extremely, extremely good movie for people who want to watch. It's called The Silence of Freedom. And I met the executive director of this movie, who happened to be also the person who 10 years ago was recruited by the Colombian government. His story is being described in the movie, so it's not a secret. He was being recruited by the Colombian government to rescue children from criminal networks. And in his first mission, he rescued more than 150 children. And after that, for 10 years, he was rescuing children. And so I urge people, it's a very, very heavy movie, but for people who want to learn, I urge them to watch that movie.
The Silence of Freedom. Thank you. That was very good. This is such an important subject, and I'm glad that it's coming to light. I didn't know anything about it. I've learned so much more. I know that universities, as we were saying earlier, they're starting to implement policies. I had given a talk down at the University of Florida a year ago, and a month after I gave my talk, I received something in the mail about human trafficking, saying that I needed to sign something to say that I wasn't part of it, and that sort of thing, or I would be taken out of the university system. So I think that these kinds of things that we're now seeing are good indications that the awareness campaigns are getting out there and policies are getting put into place. The symposium this weekend is on human trafficking and modern slavery in today's world. It's Saturday, April 5th, at the Meletios Cultural Center. We do ask that you register ahead of time. It's required, right, Tina? We want them to register.
Yes, we would like them to register ahead of time, but again, if people can't, because we know how we are sometimes, we will take people registrations at the door. Again, it is a free event, but we hope that people will make sure that they attend.
Oh, okay. That's great. And they can find the registration online easily enough. I did with a search, but they can also email you if they have any questions. tpapadopevents@gmail.com. And the Sound of Freedom is the film. Thank you for clarifying that. Sound of Freedom, it's a film based on a true story, and it sheds light on human trafficking, particularly child trafficking, and the dangers faced by victims. You know, years ago I had a friend who came, he was Greek, and he was a merchant marine, and he jumped ship, which we knew a lot of people years ago that had come that way. And he was working for another Greek in construction for $3 an hour. And he worked long days and was told if he said anything, he was going to get reported. And that, I felt so bad because I didn't know what to do. If I tried to report this, am I turning my friend in? Would he get in trouble? In the end, he ended up getting a lawyer, and years later he worked his way out of it. But what a horrible situation, because we feel like, gee, we want to report this, but...
There are a lot of ethical questions that we have to navigate when we deal with these situations. But the more knowledge we have, I think the better and more informed decisions we will reach.
Yeah.
And I just want to mention that we barely scratched the surface of the phenomenon right now, obviously, and I urge people to come and listen to us on Saturday. But I just want to say that the global fight of the phenomenon in every level, from prevention to protection and reintegration of victims, or how I want to call them survivors, depends on a collective effort from bottom up. So we just need to remember, I just want to finish with a positive message that we all can help.
That's right. We can make an impact.
And we can make an impact.
Yeah, that's great. Is there anything else that we should have said that we didn't say?
Meleti, I would just like to say to your listening audience, many of whom are Greek or Greek American,
yes.
Issues of debt bondage and forced labor associated with migration and looking to try to have some form of human security and economic security are ones that many of our grandparents or parents actually encountered. We all know stories of Greeks who came here in huge groups, and they came in the form of debt bondage and bonded labor.
That's right.
And so I think this is a phenomenon in that dimension of modern slavery that we have familiarity with. We may not have articulated it in those terms, but nonetheless, we've encountered it and lived it. And then finally, because it's Lent, if you'll indulge me, I think for your listening audience that's Orthodox, I would just read this passage. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And then Christ says, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And that goes back to Vaso's point. Each of us can see this, and we can take action in our own ways, and we will contribute then, one by one, step by step, to ending this scourge of our time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prodromou, Elizabeth. Thank you very, very much. Vaso, Dr. Digidiki, thank you for coming in and enlightening our audience. And I look forward to the symposium this Saturday. Tina, thank you for your leadership in the community, for bringing this, leading the Daughters of Penelope to get this symposium together. These events are massive coordination efforts, and we really hope that for all these distinguished panelists that are there, and we know that there are going to be some good discussions, that it's well attended, that it's not missed, and it's not one of those things that you can just put on replay and play at night. There are questions and answers. It's a symposium, so there'll be panel discussions and then followed by questions and answers. So it's your opportunity to get some of your questions answered here. And I want to thank you again.
Actually, and I would like to thank you, Meleti, and Teddy, of course, for allowing us to be on here today. I truly appreciate it. I wanted to make one. I've been receiving several messages, text messages from people who are asking if it's going to be live streamed. And I just want to let everyone know, unfortunately, we are not going to be live streaming this for a variety of different reasons, security primarily. So I just want to let people know that. So hopefully, Saturday will be open to you, that you'll be able to come and join us in person. And again, not only hearing the panelists, but having an opportunity to meet, these two very important people and the rest of the panelists as well. Again, experts in their fields. And I just want to say thank you to you again, and to Elizabeth and Vasileia for taking the time, their very, very busy schedule, to be here this morning. So thank you all. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε.
It's been a great
Καλό μήνα.
morning. Episis. You are tuned to Grecian Echoes, the longest-running Greek-American radio broadcast program in the country. It's Wednesdays with Meleti, and your host, Meleti Pouliopoulos.